Winter has always been a time for gathering in the longhouse and sharing information around the fire. This is our contribution to that tradition.
So the Longhouse video series has mostly been about backcountry skills. We've talked a little bit about mindset before. But, for me, there's always been a pretty strong integration between backcountry and front country. I don't really always differentiate between how I think about things. For me, backcountry is not some alternate reality. It's maybe a more fundamental reality. So I don't think it's at odds with the spirit of the Longhouse video series at all to talk more deeply about resiliency. Because resiliency applies, if you're in a backcountry survival situation, it also applies at a time like now when a lot of how things are in the backcountry start to be how things are in the front country as well. So a little bit of context. If my words are true to the extent that they're true, they should resonate with you regardless. But I'm going to give you a little bit of context, not to prove the validity of what I'm saying, but to give you some background understanding of where I'm coming from. I've always done hard things. Please don't tell anybody that maybe I've sandbagged a little bit, but I like backpacking because it is hard. I like the endurance aspect of it. I like the payoff of it. To me, there's symmetry in working really hard and achieving something great. Life isn't always like that. And so that goes back to being really young. I also spent 3 years on the Wyoming Hot Shots Wildland Fire Crew, which is physically some of the harder work that you can do, which doesn't, you can go to the gym and have a hard workout, but as far as mental endurance is concerned, there was a whole lot of, in those days we didn't really play by the rules as far as, 14 days on, 2 days off. It was supposed to be 21 off, 2 off. That didn't always happen. So, we were doing extremely hard physical labor and never really knowing when we would get rest. So, there was some mental endurance that was built. And, among some circles, hot shots are famous for their mental endurance. That was not, by any stretch, the hardest thing I've done in my life, from an endurance standpoint, from a mental endurance standpoint. When my daughters were really young, my wife and I made the decision to move from Seattle, where I was a high-tech guy, to a town where we thought that our children would be raised with better fundamental values. I looked around and saw the pace of life, the material expectations, the ease and luxury that people lived in Seattle, and knew I didn't want my children having that as the baseline for their life. And so we moved to a small town where it turned out I was overqualified for every job within my field that I applied for. And so I ended up doing a whole lot of things. For almost a decade, we never knew where, rent was going to come from. Or I shouldn't say that, but there was a lot of times when we didn't know, for months on end where we didn't know. And during that period of time, I was a construction superintendent. I sold Harley Davidsons. I pulled weeds out at the local golf course, just kind of whatever work I could get, and which really only ended once Hill People Gear, Scott and I started Hill People Gear, and it took off. So I know what that kind of financial uncertainty looks like. That was harder than being a hot shot. Harder still, though, my wife, Cameron, we were together for 19 years. And then she contracted breast cancer. And that lasted for 4 years and ended when she died in my arms at home. And, the last year of that time was excruciating. Because it was during that period of time that we all knew what was happening. I was a primary caregiver. She essentially wasn't mobile, and I had to do everything. And try to raise the kids as best I could. I'm not going to say I did well, but I held everything together anyway. So all of those things, are context for where my words are coming from and some of my insights. But, I should stop and say that my life has really been very, very easy compared to not just the way that many people live today and have been forced to live, but particularly in contrast to how things have been in the past, like the normal human condition, whatever that is. As an example, right now we're worried about a virus. Well, this isn't well known, but it is well documented that when Europeans first hit the shores of North America, the viruses they carry with them, the Athabascan peoples, all of the peoples who were here when Europeans came, had no resistance to, and those viruses went well ahead of any physical contact. They spread like wildfire. By the time Lewis and Clark crossed the continent, there had been an 80% die-off due to disease. Imagine being, a child or somebody in a village who, 80% of your village dies. Your culture's gone, everything's gone. Maybe you didn't even learn everything you needed to about how to survive in this environment, and you had to figure it out. That's kind of an extreme example, but that is the normal human condition. So, resilience. For me, I like to start at the very center of things. And when it comes to resilience, the very center of things is death and your approach to it. I think the biggest reason that people are having issues right now is because in America we are not close to or comfortable with death. Most of us have never killed something that we were going to eat. Most of us, people dying at home, I'm not going to say as a rarity, but people die in institutions more often now. We don't live with our elderly for the most part. We don't experience their decline. And frankly, mortality rates are just super, super low, like embarrassingly low. So I think a lot of Americans really feel like they're going to live forever. They've never confronted the reality of death. They've never confronted the reality of their impending death. Their certain death, right? When my first wife Cameron was dying, we kind of adopted this this attitude that said, not a thing has changed. Cancer hasn't changed anything. Always we could have died tomorrow. You could, even though she has cancer, she could die tomorrow from a car wreck. So not a thing's changed. Yeah, there's more likelihood she's going to die sooner than later, and more likelihood she's going to die from cancer than not, but it doesn't really change the fundamental rules of how we live our lives, because death is always coming. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper on death. So what death immediately does, you have to confront, when you actually confront death, you have to confront what your beliefs are about what's outside of this circle that we live in. I was raised in the Christian church, but I'm not going to knock that or any other belief system, but in my experience, it doesn't matter what ethos, what theology, what philosophy you rest on. When you are truly confronted with the reality of death, as I became intimate with it the last year of Cameron's life. She was obviously concerned about dying, concerned about what the world was going to look like without her, concerned about what the afterlife was going to look like, all kinds of concerns that you have when you're confronted with death. What I found is that no amount of theology, no amount of philosophy will actually carry you through that period of time. What you end up faced with is an existential choice. You have to make the choice, you have to actively make the choice that either you do or don't believe that there is anything outside of the circle of what we know. Now, I have lots of very good, strong reasons to believe that there's something outside of this circle. There's a lot of people who don't believe in anything outside of the circle, and that's fine. I can't speak to what what your mindset looks like. I've read some, it's interesting, but because that is not where I am, I can't speak to what that looks like, but I can speak to what it looks like to make the choice, the existential choice that there is something outside of the circle. Because I went into Cameron's convalescence with strong beliefs that there was something outside the circle, and even so I was tested. Even so I had to remake the choice that there is something outside of the circle. And, you know, to even go deeper, if you don't believe that, maybe you just need to let go. And, you know, I'm not a mental health professional. I know you don't want to tell somebody who's got suicidal thoughts, well, if you really believe that, kill yourself. I'm not saying that, but I can say that for me, for somebody who has struggled with mental illness, you know, in their life, very, very low grade. It's not a huge deal. But I have had dark nights where I have had to make the existential choice that, in fact, A, there is something outside of that circle, and B, overall, there is benevolence outside of the circle of what we know. I've gotten to a point in my life where I believe that not only is there benevolence outside of the circle of what we know, but for the most part, I don't even understand the rules by which the game is played. You know, we sit here and we make evaluations about what's going on inside of our circle and what's just and what isn't, and what's fair and what isn't. And I think that the totality of existence so transcends our understanding that there's not really even much point judging. We simply are faced with what we're faced with, and we either have faith that fundamentally what we are faced with is for a greater good or not. I have made the decision that what we are faced with is for the greater good. That's principle one. If you haven't ever had that dark night where you've had to make the choice that there is something greater than this circle, and you have faith in its benevolence, you need to. Because, I don't know, there might be people who go their entire life just resting on what they've been told in church, and that's enough belief for them. In my life, the things I've been faced with, that didn't cut it. I had to make the existential choice. And it's an act of creation, but it's also an act of connection, my belief. It's an act of connection with what is outside of the circle that we know. If you haven't done that and you've got some time on your hands, you're afraid of death now, which is what, you know, I think for a lot of people the fear of this virus is, you might come to terms with that. Face it head on. Because once you have made that choice, life gets a lot better. Life gets a lot better. Because principle one is there's something outside of the circle. Principle two is there is a greater plan that's really beyond our understanding. Well, then I have to trust that what's coming is going to be okay. It may be difficult. It may not be what I like. It may not be what I want. But fundamentally, it's okay. And once you have that faith, then, all right, whatever happens is going to happen. Fundamentally, it's going to be okay. Does that mean things are going to be the same? Of course not, right? Like I said before, we've been living in an embarrassingly unprecedented time of plenty and ease, to the point that I believe psychological maturity has declined significantly in the last 50 years, because we are not faced with the realities that are required for a human being, for a human intellect to actually psychologically mature. Now we're starting to be faced with a few of those times in a very, very small way, like embarrassingly small way, and it's a time to reorganize. It's a time for personal reorganization. You have to say, what has value out of the world that I know, beyond the world that I know? Because so humans, you know, it's been said by anthropologists, I think it was a Boaz quote, but at any rate, that, you know, essentially the world as we conceive of it is really just a thin fabric of understandings, of experiences. And, you know, what I've found is that, you know, so people who've grown up in a very easy time, what they rely on, their fabric of experience, is extremely superficial when it comes to the kind of resilience necessary to get through any kind of difficulty. Like we're used to going to the grocery store, and whatever item we want is on the shelf at any hour of the day, which is madness, honestly. It's, I'm sitting right here. Like there's a pictograph over there, I don't know, a quarter of a mile over there, and it's Fremont pictograph, and those people, what they didn't grow, they didn't eat. Even my mother, who grew up on a farm, a significant percentage of what they were going to eat, they had to somehow come up with. And I'm not lecturing, I'm just trying to put into perspective that what you have come to think of as normal and reliable, and what you've built your life on, is pretty ephemeral, in any kind of deep sense. So basically, where is the value and where does the resilience come from? Well, what has value beyond the material culture that we live in? And I would say what has value deeper than that. Well, for me personally, and I don't know if this is a characteristic of the species, I don't know, there's certainly plenty of record in it. Jesus went into the desert. The mystic always went to the mountain. For me, there is something fundamental that speaks to my soul about spending time on the land. The pace of it, I've talked about that before, is very different, and I don't want to call it inhuman, but the pace of time, the pace of recognition, the pace of understanding is very different and very grounding. I don't know if that's everyone, but I tend to think it is. I tend to think that everyone needs that, and there's a lot of people that don't get it and don't understand what it is they're missing. So, if you think in terms of value, the land and our connection to it has value. We're a group animal. There are many animals that are mostly solitary. Bear is mostly a solitary animal. Coyote, he can be social, but he also can be very solitary, and there's part of his adaptability. But humans are not like that. We are social animals. Even introverts tend to be social animals, and those deep connections, and if, like me, you believe that there's a deeper animus within us that has some kind of spiritual connection, has some kind of connection beyond the spiritual world, every connection we have with another member of our tribe is not just a social connection, it is a spiritual connection. And I think a lot of the atrocity that we see, particularly in the modern world, comes with lack of that spiritual connection to creation around us. And again, whatever your belief system is, I don't care. I'm just talking about very fundamental things that you can mask in any kind of theology you want to, but fundamental things that I've experienced that I believe to be true about the connection with the land, the connection with individuals, that is a spiritual connection. That is part of where resilience comes from. On a very logistical standpoint, the times that Scott's been there for me, other family members have been there for me in difficult times. Yeah, that's been, emotionally speaking, as far as, even resource sharing, it's huge. But fundamentally, I'm talking about a spiritual connection, not just with the land, but with the people around you. There is value there. Art, the creation of art, whether your art is more precise, you're designing a backpack and it's more engineering oriented, whether your art seeks to explicate things that cannot be explicated in words, that creative act is an act of processing the spiritual and making it manifest, and that's also something that is deeply grounding. It leads to deep resilience. and it's funny, I'm sitting here struggling, like, okay, what else leads to deep resilience? I don't have a whole lot else than that. I really don't. It's, what I can tell you is there's a mindset perspective that says that this isn't a big deal, but I guarantee at a certain point you will feel like something is a big deal. And so you either come to terms with death and therefore the preciousness of our time here, or you haven't. And if you have, you realize that every day that we are here is a gift, something to be grateful for. I happen to believe that what's outside of this circle is more wonderful than this, and there's really no reason to fear it. But at the same time, I have also understood the uniqueness of what is here that I do not believe carries outside of the circle. And I can also tell you that the animal part of us does not want to let go of life. I've seen that firsthand. Even when we're ready to depart, we hang on and the body hangs on. And I can tell you that every day here is a unique gift. And so if you've been there, you already understand that. Then step two, saying, there is a plan. It's a plan that's beyond my understanding, but it also holds values that are beyond my understanding. And fundamentally, things will be okay. Step two, if you can rest on those two things in your mind, you can get through anything. And then if you can build beyond that to the other things I've talked about, if you can start building spiritual connection to what's around you through the land, through other people, both socially and spiritually, and then if you can participate in the act of creation. Actually, here's just a weird anecdote. I was traveling high in the mountains one year, and I was basically taking a direct route to a summit, and there was a band of snow I got to that was vertical. It was only like 10 feet high, but it was soft vertical snow. I had no crampons, and I would have had to traverse hundreds of yards either direction to climb this band. Well, I looked around me at the talus field, and I selected 3 pieces of talus that were longer than they were wide. And I shoved them into this snowbank and created a staircase for myself. And it sounds like a neat trick, but to me there was something elegant about that. It was a temporary ladder that was going to melt out by that afternoon and no longer exist. But it gave me an elegant line to the top, and it was an act of beautiful creation, and even the transitory nature of it was a beautiful thing. That's a simple act of creation that to me had deep spiritual meaning and gave me deep connection. And we're in a time now where our world is getting slowed down. I see only upside from that. Because when you look at the things that really matter, that truly matter to our existence here, a whole lot of what we live with most of the time is nothing more than noise. It's nothing more than chatter. The social world, the fast-paced life, all of these things tend to keep us away from deep connection. They keep us away from understanding the reality of death and therefore of life. They keep us away from building connections. They keep us away from creating for the most part. Some of us are fortunate in that our jobs can be acts of creation. But this is a big gift we've been given, where we have to slow down. We have no choice for the most part. Most of us are not moving around much. Most of us have more time. So we're not only confronted with some deeper realities, but we also have the time to process them and do something about it. Humans are adaptable creatures, and they restructure easily. That's the key to our success, is our adaptability. It's probably time for you to consider a personal restructuring. Go all the way to the core, like I've talked about. understand at the core who you are and what you're about, and then focus on restructuring towards things that have value. This is a good opportunity for the world. We haven't seen this kind of disruption in a generation, maybe. World War II was probably the last time World War II was considerably more than this, considerably more. But, I think since then this might be the most disruptive thing that's happened since then. Most of us have lived our whole lives without ever having to contemplate things that matter, which is just strange when you think about it. So take this as a time to restructure. I see this as a gift. It's a gift where perhaps the world will become a better place by driving people more deeply and forcing them, but also allowing them to personally restructure towards things that have value rather than things that don't. For me, this is all about a return to value.